Divisions in Israel over the war in Gaza have been highlighted in the country's parliament today, the Knesset. Families of Israeli hostages who are still being held in Gaza have broken through security and stormed a finance meeting. Well, they were protesting that the finance committee was actually sitting, deliberating, while their children were still in captivity. Were shouting shame on you and demanding that the committee members get up and act. The families called for the government to do more to secure the release of their loved ones. The protest highlights growing domestic dissent in Israel about the war with Hamas that's now in its fourth month. Well, it comes as Palestinians in southern Gaza say the Israeli bombardment is the most intense they've experienced since the war began. The Gaza Health Ministry says that 190 Palestinians have been killed in the last 24 hours. Well, let's go live to Jerusalem and to our Middle East correspondent, Mark Lowen. And Mark, let's start with those events in the Knesset. Just to give us a sense of how much pressure Benjamin Netanyahu is now coming under from hostage families.
I think pretty significant pressure, Matthew, and growing by the day. This was quite dramatic scenes, although the numbers themselves were quite small. But the fact that these family members managed to get into that finance committee meeting, I mean, we think actually they were probably invited by another committee into the Knesset, and then once they finished their appearance, they then sort of pushed through security into the finance committee. You can just see the depth of emotion. I mean, one person shouted, "We won't let you breathe until our kids come back." Another held a placard saying, "You will not sit here while they die there." There is a real sense from many of the relatives of the 130 or so hostages who are still not back here in Israel, unknown how many of them are dead, that the government is not doing enough to prioritize their release. And last night, on Sunday night, Benjamin Netanyahu gave a press conference in which he said he would flatly reject any hostage release deal that would ensure that Hamas could regroup in Gaza, that Israel would have to withdraw its troops, and that would allow Palestinian prisoners to be released from Israeli jails. He said he would not strike a deal with, as he put it, those Hamas monsters. So, he is determined to push on with this offensive with the aim, in his words, of complete destruction of Hamas. But the families of the hostages and many Israelis, in fact the majority of Israelis according to opinion polls, feel that the priority needs to be the release of those hostages.
And Mark, let's turn to events on the ground, because reports from southern Gaza from some people saying it's the most intense bombardment they've seen since the war actually began.
Yeah, I mean, the health ministry in Gaza, run by Hamas, has said that 50 people were killed in overnight bombing and 100 people injured around Khan Yunis. There is intense bombardment now, aerial and naval, around Khan Yunis, which is where Israel believes the top Hamas commanders are holed up. It is focusing also around a couple of hospitals in the south, one of which has been stormed, with Israeli troops arresting the medics or taking them in for questioning, the medics inside that hospital, and another one, it has been surrounded, we understand, by Israeli tanks. Israel insists, of course, that medical facilities are being used by Hamas to launch attacks against Israeli soldiers. That is something that is denied by the medics and by the authorities down in Gaza. But there is a real sense that the south, of course, remains the focus of the military activity, and that from Khan Yunis, more and more refugees are moving even further south to Rafah. Rafah is right on the border with Egypt, and that is where the vast majority of Gazans are now taking refuge. It is a city that before the war had a population of around 280,000, now has about 1.3 or 1.4 million people sheltering there. That gives you a sense of the sort of the inundation of people who have gone down to Rafah. And the BBC has now estimated that about 75% of Khan Yunis, which is the main city in southern Gaza, is now under Israeli control.
Mark Lowen there in Jerusalem. Thanks very much. Well, I've been speaking to Maru Levy, whose brother-in-law is one of the hostages being held in Gaza. And I started by asking for his reaction to those scenes in the Knesset and whether he shared their frustration.
Yes, of course. I'm part of the families, and we communicate all the time. This weekend was very intense. Ever since Hamas published another psychological warfare video on Friday, it led to a lot of frustration, anger, sadness among the families. And so today, every Monday, families of hostages go to the Knesset, to Parliament, to go to the different committees. One of the committees, the Finance Committee, there was an issue of entering. So families decided to enter without a permission and voice their pain. I spoke with one of them earlier today, and I understand the reasons why they did it. They want the committees to continue discussing the issues of the hostages.
Can you also see why they're questioning the basic strategy, the notion of maximum force to get more hostage releases, except it hasn't yielded anything, and there's a growing frustration among some of the family members about the basic strategy here?
Yeah, I think there are varying opinions among the families about the strategy, about the policy of the government. And this weekend we saw several rallies, one of which was held in front of the Prime Minister's residence in Caesarea. I understand why there is criticism of the policy. As you said, it didn't yield the results we wanted. Hostages are not returning home. And then we receive news about killed hostages every week. And so we beg, and we don't beg, we demand the government to take our voices into account and ensure that the policy they implement in the Gaza Strip ensure that hostages return home. That needs to be the short-term goal of the government and of this operation, irrespective of the long-term goal of dismantling Hamas.
I'll come back to that point in a moment, but let me ask you when and what you've heard most recently about your brother-in-law.
So the last we've heard about my brother-in-law was in late November from one of the hostages who was released. He was alive then, but sadly we have no news about him or about any of the hostages held captive by Hamas. I wish I had a better answer, but the ICC is not allowed to visit them. We don't receive proof of life. And the Israeli authorities do all they can to provide us information, but obviously that's limited to an extent because of security concerns. And Hamas will not provide us that information. All they do is provide psychological warfare videos, as they did last weekend and on Friday.
President Biden's Middle East coordinator is now in Cairo trying to make progress on all of this. US officials are reported as saying one of the further complications is that Hamas's demand is for a permanent ceasefire for any further hostage releases. Is that, in your view, a price worth paying?
I'm not responsible for making that decision. I think Israel has a viable interest that it needs to preserve. If I look outside as an analyst, let's say, rather than a family member, and I understand the complexity, the geopolitical complexities that the government is facing, I think that we cannot allow Hamas to remain in power in the Gaza Strip after this operation, after this war, for the mere fact they committed to continue doing October 7 over and over again. And so I hope the different stakeholders will be able to bring both Israel and Hamas and their accomplices closer in the negotiations. It seems like there are different proposals.
Yes.
Families met the Prime Minister today, and he said that Israel provided a counter proposal over this weekend. He couldn't elaborate about it, and we hope that proposal will bring about some progress in negotiations.
A final question then, because we're seeing a real intensification in terms of the intensity of attacks in the south around Khan Yunis. How difficult, how excruciating is it for families every single day to watch events on the ground when they have no idea if their loved ones are in that vicinity?
I think it's difficult. Generally, we don't want to witness war and suffering in our region. So it's difficult to see it, difficult to read the news, difficult to wake up every morning worrying that we hear about a loved one of us being killed, whether those who are held hostage, like my brother-in-law, soldiers on the ground. And I have compassion to any non-combatant who is involved in the middle of this fight. It's difficult, and I don't trust Hamas to be a good faith partner in solving this crisis. The opposite. They're doing the opposite. They already killed a few of the hostages and released videos that really make our life very excruciating. I hope this will end soon for the sake of everyone. But I understand that it cannot end without the release of the hostages, without the dismantling of Hamas.
Maru Levy talking to me a little earlier on the programme.